I want my mummy.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology, are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 15. I'm your host, Sarah Head, with my co-host, Ken Fader, and today we're talking about a variety of topics. We're starting off with a rundown of what Ken's been doing with his summer, then we're going to talk about the Indiana mummy, and then we're going to finish up with an actual controversy and actual archaeology. Who was here first, Clovis or somebody else? So get ready to think critically.
Funny beady blokes, you will see, are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm good. How's it going up there?
It's going great. We're having a really nice summer. Beautiful weather. Amazingly not super humid for New England this time of year, so it's all good.
I mean, you had great weather because it has been. So I just moved, and when I moved, I went and did a project down in Virginia, and the 2 weeks that the project went, the lowest temperature was 100 degrees after heat index.
No, I don't like that.
It was miserable.
I'd vote against that. I would complain to whoever's in charge of the weather. The meteorologists say, no, this is not good weather for archaeology. Well, I always love that around here, the funny thing is, in the middle of the summer, on days that it's really going to be hot, it's really going to be humid, the mosquito count is enormously high, the pollen count is high, and the meteorologists will say, you know what, today's a good day to stay indoors. And they're saying that as I'm driving into the field with a bunch of archaeology students saying, yeah, well, if you could do archaeology indoors, that would be a good suggestion. But since you can't, we're going to have to gut it out. And we always do.
I have some friends doing a phase 3 out in Arkansas, and I guess they're working for a really great company, apparently. It got so hot, last week was it, that the company went out and bought everyone one of those big excavation tents.
Oh, is that right?
To put over their units, and then bought them. They're like these cool tech towels. They're made out of some kind of smart fabric that you get it wet and then you snap it.
I have,
and it actually
I've heard of that.
Keeps you cool.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
So they bought everyone a towel, and just for them to keep. They don't want them back.
Well, yeah, after a bunch of archaeologists sweated into that towel, you wouldn't want it back either.
No, you don't want that thing back. That's not water that you're getting cooled off by anymore.
Yeah, but now they're making shirts out of that material and hats out of that material, so it's, I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical, as I am about everything, about clothing that's going to keep you cool, but I don't know.
But it makes you want to try it, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You're I can eat $40 for one shirt. If I like it, I'll get another one. If not,
Uh-huh.
But, so, tell us about your field school that you just finished up.
So, anybody who's listening to this, you've heard us from week to week, but we had a bunch of shows that were kind of stockpiled, and so I've been gone for, I guess, 4 or 5 weeks. So Sarah and I haven't spoken 4 or 5 weeks because I was in the middle of my archaeology field school. This is the 3rd season. We're back at a site in northwestern Connecticut. We have radiocarbon dates real clear of just shy of 3,000 years ago, 2,850, something like that. And the site is, in fact, it's not an occupation site where we've been excavating. It's an industrial site. It's a site where the native inhabitants of northwestern Connecticut quarried soapstone. Sarah, do you have, out in the Midwest, is soapstone a big deal prehistorically?
It is a big deal because it's rare. We don't get a lot of soapstone tools or points or anything like that. Not like you guys are getting. We get soapstone figurines and we get soapstone pipes occasionally, but it's not we have pottery. So it's not on the scale that you guys are finding
Yeah.
out.
See, that's the cool thing is here that ceramic technology doesn't move into southern New England until about 3,000 years ago, give or take. And we've talked about how do archaeologists know if a technology is indigenous and developed in place, or if it came in from the outside. And the same kind of skeptical approach we use to discuss whether or not we think ancient Egyptians inspired the Olmec, or extraterrestrial aliens or Atlanteans inspired the Egyptians. That same kind of skepticism we apply when somebody says, "Well, we've got pottery here in southern New England. Where did it come from? Was it an entirely indigenous development, or did it come in from the outside?" And here, the evidence is really clear. We don't see the halting steps of the development of pottery technology here. It arrives, bam, 3,000 years ago, full blown.
Huh.
And when you look at the style of it, it almost certainly comes from the West and from the South. So the earliest pottery in Connecticut is called Vinette 1, and it's a thick-bodied, conical base, it's kind of ugly stuff. It's not, of course, it's not glazed, it's not made on a wheel, it's not painted. It's a very plain ceramic type.
So you don't even get like ochre gray, like red paint on it or
Nothing.
anything?
There's nothing.
Because we get that
No.
here every once.
This stuff
in the
it's
Midwest.
just basically whatever the color of the clay when you fire it. That's what you got. Now the ancient folks did add designs, and some of it is actually pretty sophisticated, pretty beautiful stuff. They would impress, say, twine into the clay when the clay was still soft, was still malleable, and that would give a corrugated texture to the pots. When it was when it's really soft, they would impress designs, push designs into the actual wet clay, and that would add some element of design to it. And also, when it was leather hard before firing, they would incise the pots with dots, or with parallel lines or wavy lines. And so you do get some, especially up towards the top of the pot, the collar or the rim, you get that kind of design. But that shows up full blown from the West and South about 3,000 years ago. Before that, along with making vessels out of wood or bark or fabric or woven stuff, they did use this soft rock called soapstone or steatite. It's a soft metamorphic rock, and the cool thing about it is that, if the listeners are familiar with the Mohs hardness scale, which is like a 19th century scale that was developed by this a geologist whose name was Moh, M-O-H, who said, look, if one material can scratch another, the material that can scratch it is harder than the material that can be scratched. And if you take a whole bunch of materials and scratch each one, try to scratch the other, you can come up with this kind of linear scale where diamond is a 10. That's the hardest thing. Can't scratch a diamond with anything. And then there's 9.5 and 9 and 8, depending on what can scratch, what gets scratched by what materials. Your fingernail is probably around a 2 on the Mohs hardness scale, and soapstone is about a 1.5. So you literally can scratch this rock with your fingernail. And anything that's harder, like the materials we find at the site, a lot of it's the picks, the tools made for quarrying the stone, are made out of quartzite, and quartzite has on the Mohs scale is like a 7.5. So it's very, very easy to carve out blanks of chunks of soapstone from this large boulder, and that's what we've got here at this site. Anyway, the cool thing is that soapstone is available. It's not ubiquitous, right? You can't find it everywhere. It's actually in very limited concentrations in a few areas in southern New England. And wherever the natives found that stuff, those who lived in the area monopolized it, and they were able to trade either the soapstone as blanks or as finished objects all over the place. So we find soapstone bowls that date to a little before 3,000 years ago, throughout much of southern New England, but you only have the sources in a very limited number of places. And here in northwestern Connecticut, we have a couple of really good soapstone sources. Now, the large chunk of soapstone, and it appears to be a glacial erratic, so it was plucked from somewhere else and pushed south. This large piece has, it's got remnants of half-finished bowl forms across the face of this piece of rock. So when you look at it, it really was amazing. When the place was first discovered, it was entirely the rock was entirely covered with soil, and only a couple of the very high points were peeking up out of the forest soil, and it just looked like two boulders. And then as we saw it with soapstone, and as we began excavating it, we realized those two boulders were in fact part of a bigger rock. They were the very tops and the exposed tops of what was a much larger piece of soapstone. And we call them unharvested bowls. And it's just, Sarah, it just knocks my socks off every time I look at it, that you can actually see a moment frozen in time from 3,000 years ago as these bowl forms were being produced on the core, on the source, as these quarriers were doing it.
These bowl forms, were they hollowing the bowl out first?
No, that's the thing is that in most cases what they're doing is they are shaping the bowl form upside down. So what you got is the top is rounded, and these things, when they get really close to removal of the bowl, it looks like a mushroom, where the stem of the mushroom that's all that's attaching the bowl form to the source itself. And then what they would do is they would drill through that stem, and we have actual drill marks, and then pry that piece off. Then you flip it right side up, where now the rounded part, which before was the top, is now the bottom. And then they hollowed out the bowl and carved handles. Very often there are lugs or handles carved onto the sides of it. And in fact, this year we actually found in the stuff that the quarriers threw away, we found what amounts to about half of a finished bowl, and it's a beautiful piece of work. And it still has one of the lugs on it. And the other interesting thing about the site is that the site dates to about the very tail end of the use of soapstone. And I have this image, right, this scenario in which these guys are working hard at isolating these bowl forms, removing them from the soapstone, carving them out, and then trading them. And in the middle of this, so they're still in the middle, they still have left some of these bowl forms are in place. Somebody walks through the forest with a clay pot and says, you know what, you guys, we don't need this stuff anymore. Clay is everywhere. So it's really cool how a technology that required a material that's available in only very discrete locations is replaced by a technology that has its disadvantages, to be sure. Clay pots break much more readily than soapstone. Right. You have to fire clay pots. You don't have to fire soapstone, obviously. But clay, just about anywhere you dig a hole in southern New England along a stream or river, you find clay. So you no longer have to maintain these trading networks to get some of that rare soapstone, because you don't need it anymore. Because just imagine these guys going to all this work and having this wonderful resource that everybody else wants, and so you're able to trade. And now, guess what? We don't need you anymore. We don't need that resource anymore.
And I would assume that the soapstone harvesting would be very, very labor intensive.
It's labor intensive
compared to pot manufacturing, which is not that difficult. I mean,
right.
There are steps you have to go through to get a finished pot, but they're not nearly as labor intensive as carving the rock out,
exactly,
carving the bowl.
Yeah, but
I'm sure not as pretty though.
Yeah, but soapstone, it's a multi-step process, right? First, you got to find the stuff, and then you got to carve out or isolate lozenges of the soapstone. Then you got to remove it. Anywhere along this process, you can run into irregularities or impurities in soapstone, so it breaks. You have to pull it out, and then you got to go through this long process of carving them out. I imagine that I think the big advantage of ceramics is that the raw material that's not an issue. You can find that raw material anywhere. And clay is also, for my money, it's a much more creative medium. There's a lot more you can do with clay to make something that distinguishes your work from anybody else's work.
And it's a lot more forgiving. Like,
Yeah.
if you mess up at the early stages of it, you can just mush it all back down and start
You
over.
got it, yeah.
With the soapstone bowls, if you screw up early on, I mean, you're probably done with that bowl. I mean, that's probably why you have that really nice bowl that's, you know, that one that you said you
Right.
found that was like half of it. It's probably had an impurity or it fractured. And, you know, if they've gone through that much effort and then there's that one impurity running right through it and it just pops it in two. I mean, that had to be really frustrating for somebody.
There are some examples in southern New England of soapstone bowls that broke, and well, you can no longer use them for to hold liquids, but you can use them to hold seeds or nuts. And so what they did is they drilled holes and kind of sewed the pieces back together again, so you still could, with all that work, you might as well, apply a little adaptive reuse to the material. So that's pretty good, though. Really exciting.
The Japanese do that. The early Japanese and Chinese did that.
Is that right?
With their broken potteries and stuff. They would, if something were to break, they would drill little tiny holes in it, and then, well, they would do one of two things. They'd either stitch it back together, or with wire, or they would take gold or lead or silver and pour it into the cracks and reset it with a metal. And it's made some very pretty pieces of pottery and stuff, because you have that contrast then at that point.
Sure.
But, I mean, that's way more advanced than, well, not terribly, actually. The metallurgy part, yeah, but beyond that. So you guys are looking at the quarry site.
Right.
And you don't have any, like, is there an occupational site that's nearby?
Here's the cool part. Back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, Yale University in Cary, Connecticut, did an excavation that is maybe 75 feet away from the quarry. It's a rock shelter, all right? And the rock shelter had clear signs of occupation and clear signs of the carving of soapstone bowls. So how cool is that? So there's the soil at the bottom of the rock shelter is all full of soapstone dust, so it has that greasy kind of icky feel to it. There are actual tools up in the rock shelter for carving bowls. There was at least one complete bowl and broken pieces of bowls. And when they excavated that, the Yaleys thought that the rock shelter itself was the quarry, and that maybe this rock overhang had been expanded as the folks living there were carving out the soapstone. Problem was, there's no soapstone seam in the rock, but they didn't know where they knew it had to be close. They figured it was the rock shelter itself, but they never apparently walked down the hill. Or maybe when they were there, the pieces of soapstone were completely covered over. I told my students that where we were digging, the quarry there, that was the latrine for the Yale students. So we got a big charge out of that. But so
was it actually the latrine?
I don't think so, but you never know. You have to lie to people every once in a while. So I'm pretty sure that rock shelter, that was the occupation. That's where. And up there, they're not just quarriers. They're hunting. There's animal bones. There's evidence of their hearths up there. So that's where they're living. And the quarriers are then coming down and quarrying the stone. The other thing that's really cool that we only discovered in 2013 is that we did a pedestrian survey across this forest. And I'm sure you've done lots of pedestrian surveys, and it's always like a real challenge in a forest because you got trees and boulders on the surface. But what we found was the area, it's acres around where the soapstone quarry itself was located. There are these large quartzite boulders, most of which show clear signs of chipping. And in some of the cases, you even find the flakes of quartzite like stockpiled in and around these quartz boulders that we excavated. And then you find the materials, the tools that were used to quarry the soapstone made out of those quartz tools, and the tools used to carve out the bowls, to hollow them out, made from mostly quartzite. So it's kind of
I'd be
cool.
surprised that they're tool making with quartzite anyway, because I've seen quartz points and I just think they're hideous.
It's really tough. The advantage we have here is that these guys knew exactly what they were doing, and they ignored quartzite boulders that were really coarse. It was a coarse quartzite where the crystals were very large, and they found beautiful, very fine-grained quartzite, and they used that almost exclusively. And some of these boulders are huge, and the hammerstones they were using, you can see the bulbs of percussion. You can see the faceting on the cores. And a student of mine, Matt Sweeten, who now is, in fact, a graduate student of Bruce Bradley in England. And Matt actually found some ethnohistorical stuff, I believe it was from New Guinea, of a process of taking large quartzite boulders that are in situ, in place, and the native people taking hammerstones that weigh 20 or 30 pounds and battering the hell out of these boulders to remove large chunks of quartzite, which they then work down into tools. So,
well, yeah, you got to get it off there somehow.
Very, very cool stuff. I do experimental archaeology, man, but I don't want a hammerstone to be much bigger than one I can hold in my hand. And 20 or 30 pounds, I'm going to get tired in a hurry. But
well, and you're going to have to put that above your head and bring it. I mean, I can see what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
And obviously it worked.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's cool stuff. Very, very cool stuff.
So is there anything particular you want to tell about your findings this summer, or are you guys still working through the data?
Yeah, we are absolutely still working through the data. We have lots and lots. I mean, what we understand now is that there were at least a couple of different ways, depending on the quality of the soapstone, on this one large boulder. That's about 12 feet long and about 5 feet wide. So some of the finer stuff they were actually carving, but some of the stuff where it's a little bit blockier, they were removing it in chunks by percussion, and you can see that pretty clearly. We think we've reached the bottom of it. We're sort of working down under it, and what it looks like is that we have just now gotten to the level where the quarriers were standing, because this was all buried when we got there, but we've got a level where, okay, that's where all the soapstone dust is, and you can even look under the boulder. So we're starting to there's kind of a keel at the bottom of it, so it's balanced. I used to joke that, my God, we get two of the bigger students on either side, we could get the thing rocking, but that's not going to happen. But you can see even under it, you can see all the peck marks from the attempt to smooth out the surface before they started carving out bowls. So we've got that. We have an area where soapstone was stockpiled, a literal pile of soapstone that was being removed from the quarry. That we think the next thing would have been to bring it up to the rock shelter, where that's most of the finish work was done up there, not at the quarry itself. And we have one tip of a spear point, and I can't tell you what style it is because I don't have the base, so no notion of that. It's a hornfels, so it's a flint-like material. And there was enough charcoal. We recovered a bunch more charcoal this time as well, and we're going to try to get some multiple radiocarbon dates to see if we can confirm that date of 2850. I'm pretty sure about that. It makes sense, but of course it would be nice to have multiple dates.
Yeah, it's always good to have.
Ultimately, I mean, the ultimate goal here, Sarah, is that when I was an undergrad, maybe I mentioned that before in the podcast. When I was an undergrad, I worked for a professor, an archaeologist, Phil Wigan, great guy, an amazing archaeologist. And Phil for years collected turquoise. So his thing was turquoise. And he collected raw turquoise from mines scattered throughout the American Southwest. And he had access to turquoise artifacts from Mexico. Now, there are no turquoise sources in West Mexico where he was finding these things. So his hypothesis was that there was trade between the native people of Mexico and the people who are in now the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and I think California. And that's really cool to think of trade that long ago, across hundreds of miles. And the way that Weigand was testing that was through trace element chemistry. So he would get the signatures of the chemical makeup, the chemical fingerprint of the raw turquoise he was collecting in various places in the American Southwest, and comparing that fingerprint, that chemical fingerprint in that turquoise and those sources to the actual artifacts in Mexico. And he did this amazing job of actually connecting the sources and the artifacts and showing, yep, absolutely there was trade. This trace element analysis, it was neutron activation analysis. We did it at Brookhaven National Labs. It's in a research reactor. That kind of study has been done on turquoise and also on obsidian. And it's a great way to trace obsidian even to individual volcanoes. So you find obsidian at a site and you go, well, where did that obsidian come from? Its chemical signature. It doesn't look any different from any other piece of obsidian anywhere in the world, but its chemical signature shows it came from this region, this volcanic region. So that's pretty cool. What I'm hoping is that soapstone will be similarly cooperative, so that someday we'll be able to pick up a soapstone bowl on the north shore of Long Island, where I don't believe there's any soapstone source there, but there are soapstone bowls prehistorically, and to be able to say the source of that soapstone was northwestern Connecticut because its chemical signature matches precisely enough that we can trace it to that location. That would be cool.
Well, there is a grad school project for some lucky PhD.
Hey, listen,
candidate.
I mention that to students all the time. So when you go to graduate school, take some chemistry classes, and let's see if we can do what people have done for turquoise and obsidian. Can we do the same thing for steatite? Soapstone is also steatite's just the more technical term for it. And it's like, I don't know if it's even possible, or maybe soapstone is just so heterogeneous in terms of its trace elements that you can't get a firm enough grasp on the chemical signature, or it varies so much that you won't be able to do it. But it's certainly worth a shot.
You never know till you try.
Exactly.
That's
so.
true.
Exactly so.
So if you're listening to the podcast and you're a graduate student and you're looking for a project, there you go.
Yeah,
Ken just helped you
out. I've been looking recently. There have been a number of articles over the last few decades on folks attempting to, not in Connecticut, not in southern New England, but elsewhere, attempting to connect soapstone sources and soapstone artifacts. So this is not my idea, man. People have talked about this previously, and it's and have made the effort. So we got our fingers crossed that it'll work.
Well, there you go. Yep. Okay, so we're going to take a real quick break, and when we come back, we are going to discuss some recent news that might have something to do with mummies.
Uh-oh.
All right, we're here with Jordan Harbinger from the Art of Charm Training and Podcast. So, Jordan, what are a few big ideas or concepts that you've learned from interviewing some of the amazing people you've had on the podcast over the last few years?
It's funny, it's really informed my opinion of how business works. And it's great because I've gotten the same insight that I seek to provide for the audience in terms of what makes successful people great at what they do. So I have been able to talk to people that I otherwise wouldn't have had access to. And I've learned things like, not only is it all about who you know and not what you know, but that's actually a good thing, because once you get good at creating and building relationships, which is obviously what we teach on the show for business reasons, the sky's the limit, because you don't have to be the smartest guy in the office. You don't have to sleep under your desk putting in hours. You don't have to do FaceTime to make sure people know you're working. It's about the relationships that pull you forward. So you end up getting pulled upward instead of fighting your way upward through the crowd of, other people at your level. And I found that every single business that I know of, essentially that's in person, that's successful, has had that experience and intentionally cultivates it. So that's really changed the way that I look at work. It's changed the way that I look at business. And it's really given me the idea that and what has brought Art of Charm to this level, which is focus on relationships as well as building your platform, building your skill set, learning, because one in the absence of the other will not get you there. And I have that on good authority because of the people that I'm able to talk to on the show.
You know, that's I'm glad you said that, because people like to think that in archaeology, in our field especially, we're isolated against other fields and we're different. But you said exactly what gets people jobs and gets them moving up the chain is building relationships and building your skill set at the same time. And this is such a small field. I'm working with a few guys right now that we've worked on the same projects across the country but never met each other, and we know a lot of the same people, and it's just an incredibly small thing, and building those relationships really helps.
Exactly. I mean, if I know that you're a skilled archaeologist and I know that Mike is a skilled archaeologist, why wouldn't I hire the person I like the most? I mean, I would. And even if it's like, oh, well, you know, Chris, sometimes his work is late. I mean, obviously this is hypothetical. I don't know what work you would turn in, but sometimes it's late. Well, oh yeah, but you know, I know he's a good guy. He shows up on time. He's pleasant to work with. So if he's a couple days late with something, there's probably a good reason. All right, hire him, right? But if it's like, oh, well, this guy, he turns the stuff in late, and this other guy, all other things being equal, I haven't heard anything about him, well, then you lose, right? So it always pays. There's no scenario in which having a relationship with somebody hurts you. There's only a scenario in which you not having that relationship hurts you. And there are plenty of scenarios, as I just mentioned before, where it helps, and I've only seen that help. So all of the things being equal, it's one of the most important determinant factors in success. So it seems if you don't think it's important, you're just oblivious to the secret game being played around you. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's just that you're the guy who doesn't get it. Right.
Awesome. Well, if you want to learn how to build your relationship skills and learn some of these things that we've just talked about, check out The Art of Charm wherever you download podcasts and over at www.artofcharm.com.
Okay, so we're back, and so Ken, have you been following the news at all?
Oh, I avoid the news at all costs. Who's the is it President? Was it Reagan president? I can't remember.
Oh my God. So, okay, funny story about President Reagan. Like, I'm old enough that I remember President Reagan, like, being president, if that doesn't date me.
Oh my God.
Wait.
I remember President Lincoln, so what the hell are you talking about?
I'm just saying, I was just like, I forget that, like, there was President Reagan occurred in my lifetime. Anyway, so you're not following the news, so you don't know the newest exciting discovery in the Midwest.
I have this vague notion that somebody has found a mummy, but I don't know very much about it.
Okay, so what I love so much about this story is, A, they find this damn mummy in Indiana the freaking 2 weeks after I move away. And I'm like, really? You guys go, I move away, and you all go find a damn mummy.
They were waiting to announce it until you left the state.
I know, right?
Sarah has left the building. Okay, we're safe to announce the discovery of the mummy.
The discovery of the mummy. So, and the other thing that I'm really enjoying about this story is, for some unknown reason, they are using images of Egyptian mummies when they tell this story online. So it's giving people the impression that an Egyptian-style mummy has been found in the Midwest, which is entirely false.
Sarah, when you mentioned this to me, I went online, and the only picture I saw was of a mummy wrapped in linen, and I'm thinking, wow, that's really interesting for Indiana.
Yes.
But you're telling me that's not the mummy, huh?
No, there's two images that are going about. One of them is a stock image. I don't know where it came from. The other one is an actual cataloged image from, I think, the big museum over in England. And I'm not positive they're using that image with permission or not.
So even I was convinced. You said there was a mummy in Indiana, and I looked at that and I said, how did they? Was this an Egyptian mummy that was in somebody's collection and they lost it someplace and now they're?
Well, that could be completely. That's a really good way for us to come across a mummy in Indiana. But no, the story is actually pretty typical of Indiana. It was an accidental discovery that came about during the construction of a quarry site. that was being surveyed because this is what must be done as to Section 106. And so they did apparently come across some human remains. Now I have scoured the internet looking for details, and I have tried desperately to pump my ex-coworkers for information on this, and of course they won't share because I don't work there anymore.
Mhm.
But from what I can figure out, now see, I thought a mummy in Indiana, it's going to be more like a bog mummy, like the mummies they find in Ireland and around the boggy areas.
Right, in Denmark, the bog people from Denmark.
Denmark, yeah. Yeah, I was thinking it was going to be more like a bog mummy because it gets a little swampy around Indiana, especially southern Indiana, and up in the north where the lakes are, which is where this guy was found, or this individual was found. I don't even know if it has a gender. It's just human remains at this point.
Right.
But apparently, according to my friends, that there's actually nothing remarkable about this. It's just an accidental discovery of human remains, which occurs more frequently than we would care for,
Right.
but, it happens. You can't always find everything. And the stories that are online, one of the things, aside from the images of Egyptian mummies being used, they keep saying that they've got this mummy that may or may not be either 500 or 2,000 years old. And I'm like, that's quite an age range.
Right, yeah.
So I'm going through these articles, and I'm trying to figure out where they're getting these dates from. And the only thing I can find is that they have conferred with Dr. Stephen Naraki out of the University of Indiana. And he is a physical anthropologist, a forensic anthropologist, and he works in the tri-state area, so he's familiar with finding human remains, both modern and ancient. And he has said that the remains predate the 1940s, which is the cutoff date for for homicide, I guess, in the state of Indiana. So if you find a dead body and it's older than the 1940s, it doesn't go to the police anymore. It goes to the museums or the schools.
Right, of course.
So the DNR has come, and they have collected the remains, and they have hidden them away where they hide their human remains, and I'm not going to tell people where that is. But no one has come out and said, so-and-so, this authority has given us this date range of 500 to 2,000 years. So I'm guessing people are just throwing numbers out there and hoping one of them sticks. Mm-hmm. So this is another one of those great stories that the media gets a hold of and just completely blows out of proportion.
Right. And it's one of those things that unfortunately for a lot of folks who hear the word mummy, they think that necessarily implies something out of Egypt, that the Egyptians are they're the ones who made mummies. And so if you say there's a mummy in Indiana, it doesn't help that we're using stock images of Egyptian mummies, that in a lot of people's minds, it's going to be, wow, how did the Egyptians get to Indiana? And just understand that a mummy merely means that the body has desiccated and some of the soft parts have preserved and not been eaten away by bacteria. And the Egyptians probably developed their own mummification process by being aware of the fact that in the dry desert of Egypt, it happened naturally. So it was, wow, if bodies could be preserved, let's do it one better. Let's actually study how bodies preserve and do a better job of it. And that's what the Egyptians did. But there are multiple places in the world where bodies have been found that have been mummified by natural means. Probably the best known are these high altitude mummies found in South America. And we know something about that process where the Inca took, usually it was children, I believe, who were taken from their families, were treated actually very nicely in the sense that they, based on the chemical analysis of their bodies, they were eating better than common people. They were treated as if they were very important spiritual beings. And then ultimately they were drugged with coca, with alcohol, and they were brought way up into the mountains and they were laid down and allowed to die in this very, very cold, high altitude kind of crypts. And because of the high altitude, because of the cold, because of the lack of flesh bacteria that would eat the flesh, those bodies have preserved and are amazing to see. There's one, the maiden of, she's called the maiden, the ice maiden or something like that, and her body is very, very well preserved. I mean, it's a horror show preservation. I mean, she looks like something out of a bad movie, but her nose, her hair, some of her skin has preserved, and she was, I think, like 13, 14, 15 years old when she died. But so she is a mummy. The Inca did not intentionally mummify her. They just brought her to a place that when she died, her body naturally dried out and didn't decay to nothing but bone.
Right. No, and it happens in the American West, especially in the hotter parts where it's not so humid. Just whether intentional or not, I know that there are human remains that have been discovered that are basically mummified. And well, with the bog people, the bog process, basically, like you said, it keeps the flesh-eating bacteria away. The bog people are kind of really creepy because they can look pretty fresh.
Yeah.
Aside from the fact that they turn black in color, but they're very detailed.
And you can see fingerprints and creases on faces. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, remember the Iceman from
Otzi,
Otzi, right? I mean, in a sense, he mummified by being kind of quick frozen. He was, he was like freeze dried. And in his case, they could perform an autopsy on him. They figured out what killed him. They saw that he had tattoos on his body. So the preservation was amazing in that case. But again, that was entirely accidental. Another issue, of course, another point that we really should make is if this body is a Native American, there are Native Americans who I am sure are going to want to make sure that this body is treated with enormous respect, and perhaps because of the Native American Graves Protection Act, Repatriation Act, that they're going to want to put this body back in the ground. So we have to. I think that it's all well and good to be really curious about what who this mummy was, and to learn as much as we can about it. But there's also an issue of the ethics of parading this thing around without considering the spiritual requirements of the Native Americans who are the descendants of that person. Especially if this is a 500-year-old mummy. This is somebody's great, however many greats grandparent.
That's somebody that can totally be traced back to a surviving people.
You would think, right? Absolutely.
America had quite a few Indiana had quite a few tribes in it at one point. I mean, the problem that they're having right now is they need to, and of course they've brought in an archaeology team to continue investigating the site. But they need to determine if this is a one-off, somebody fell over and died, or if this is an actual sacred site or a burial site. Because if it is the latter, then they're gonna have to close the quarry, which I find intriguing because I know that this particular quarry was controversial to begin with. So it's interesting that, I mean, if this does turn out to be a burial site, like an active graveyard of sorts, how come they didn't pick it up on the initial survey?
Yes.
But they found it now, so that's good, I guess. Before they started, digging it up to build roads and other crazy crap that they want to do out there.
But following the theme of most of our podcasts, the thing to remember here, folks, is let's wait until there's a more complete and thorough and inclusive discussion of what exactly has been found. But please, just merely by using the word mummy doesn't mean it has anything to do with Egypt. And I think shame on any media outlets that kind of automatically just include a photograph of an Egyptian mummy with lineage.
That's the thing that's killing me is all because there's two images that I'm seeing the most of, and it's just these two. They're obviously Egyptian mummies, but they're under these screaming headlines of mummy found in the Midwest and mummy found in Indiana, and it's like, this is not. You can't do that. People will associate the picture with the words that you're using. I mean, Ancient Aliens does this all the time. Here's a random image backed up by somebody saying something. Therefore, they must be referring to this image because it's what we're showing you.
The only articles I found, Sarah, were really, really very brief, very succinct.
They're all very brief,
and I read the articles and said, well, wait a minute. Is that what they're talking about? Because that's the picture. I was looking for some disclaimer like, well, that's not an actual picture of the mummy found in Indiana. That's an Egyptian mummy. But there's nothing like that. And to be honest with you, because I'm not enormously familiar with the archaeology of Indiana, I'm looking at that going, wow, was there a time in Indiana when natives mummified their deceased by wrapping them in linen? And I thought that can't be true, but I figured something fishy was going on, and that's really sloppy, and that's shoddy journalism. I'm sorry, to just automatically take an Egyptian mummy. That's good enough. It's a mummy. One mummy looks like another mummy, and that just shows ignorance.
It is ignorance, and I think on some level it is unethical as a journalist to do something like that. A, you're not giving credit to whoever's picture that is,
right,
which is a big no-no. And B, you are either unconsciously being misleading or purposefully being misleading.
Right.
By not disclaiming that the picture has nothing to do with it. And I mean, you shouldn't be using the picture there anyway. You don't know what the damn thing looks like. I mean, and from what I have picked up from my coworkers, there's nothing abnormal about the remains that were recovered. This happens more frequently than the general public is aware,
sure,
mainly because when it does happen, they bring out a forensic archaeologist. The doctor, whoever looks at it, says it's modern, it's not modern. If it's modern, it goes to the police department and gets investigated. And if it's not modern, it goes to the universities and to the state to decide who this person belongs to, and then that person's given back to whoever they belong to.
Right.
It's very rare to run into situations like the Kennewick Man, where we can't trace remains back to reasonably trace remains back to a living peoples. The Kennewick Man is a whole other can of worms,
right, and
apparently is not done being a can of worms.
Well, but I think it's pretty cool that they finally were able to conduct DNA analysis on Kennewick, and surprise, he's Native American ancestor.
Right. Yeah.
Can't say what tribe it was, but he's not a Viking, and he's not a Samoan, and he's not a white guy.
He's not Caucasian.
He's not Caucasoid. He's an American Indian.
Yeah, and the problem with Kennewick Man is he's just too old to associate with a modern living tribe.
Right.
So, that's the problem with him. This is apparently, if the date ranges that they are giving in these stories can be backed up by someone who actually understands what they're talking about, 5,000 to 2,000 or 500 to 2,000 years is not. You can still find the home for that person.
Oh, more than likely, one would hope. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, 2,000 years is not so far in the past that we don't know who was in the area. So we might have marched them out west, but they were in the area at that time.
Here you go.
So let's go ahead and take our second break of the show. And when we come back, we're going to discuss an actual controversy in archaeology that is also used with the fringe groups.
The Archaeology and Ale podcast presents a monthly series of lectures on all aspects of archaeology. These lectures are part of the Archaeology in the City program, hosted by the University of Sheffield in England. and are held at the Red Deer Pub near the end of the month. The podcast can be heard a few days later. Check out the Red Deer if you're in the area, or find this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Now let's get back to the show.
Okay, so we're back from our break, and Ken,
Yeah.
you've been in the field a while,
Uh-huh.
and you're more academic than I am because you work at a
University.
college. Yeah, you work at a university. I work out in the field digging holes for people who pay me money.
There you go. Digging
Um,
for dollars.
Yes, good one. Digging for dollars. I'm gonna name my book. Um, are you aware of the infamous Clovis first debate?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, anybody who's if you've taken a course in North American prehistory, undergraduate and especially graduate, you've heard of this stuff. And as somebody who's been around for a while, right? I mean, I was an undergraduate and hearing about some of this stuff back in the the 69 through the early 70s, and then in graduate school, and now having taught for over 35 years, I've seen the ebb and flow and all of this stuff. I think the thing that's the most curious, for those not familiar, the whole idea here is that for a while, there was a consensus among archaeologists working in North America that the oldest sites dated back to maybe around 12,000 years ago, and they reflected a particular stone tool technology called Clovis after a site in New Mexico where it was at least first defined and recognized. Fluted points. These are the points that have channels on either face of them. They're large, they're leaf-shaped, and they are associated, when they are found in association with animal bones, often those bones are of extinct forms of elephants that lived in North America at the end of the Pleistocene, the end of the Ice Age. And that there was
They're very distinct points too. When you see a Clovis point, you know you've seen
absolutely.
They're very, very distinct.
And they're beautiful. And this fluting, this technology of thinning the bottom of it by removing these large channel flakes. The fluted point is like a fluted column. These Greek columns that have these kind of concave these concavities that go from the bottom to the top, and there are multiple in the fluted points. That's what the fluted means. In any event,
carved lines.
Yeah.
They're
not found anywhere else in the world. You don't find them in Africa or in Europe or in Asia or in Australia. You only find them in the New World. Earliest in North America. You also find them to some extent in South America as well. And you have to actually understand the Clovis controversy. You almost have to go further back, which is that before those fluted points were found, the general consensus was, and by general consensus, I mean the edict sent down from on high by a physical anthropologist whose last name is Erdlichka. He's the man whose parents couldn't afford vowels in his name. He doesn't have nearly enough vowels. And Erdlichka was a brilliant scientist. He was one of the first director of the Smiths. He was an early director of the Smithsonian before it was even called the Smithsonian. And I believe he taught at Harvard. And Erdlichka kind of had a reputation of being, he was a brilliant guy. And he was I think he was also the editor of the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. And people were frightened of him. He was very strong, had very strong opinions. And Erdlichka, from his perspective as a physical anthropologist, looked at living Native Americans, and looked at the oldest skeletons found in the New World of Native Americans, looked at the biology of people in East Asia. And what Erdlichka said was, yeah, absolutely, American Indians are transplanted Asians, but the American Indians today are morphologically so similar to the skeletons that are being found, and so similar to the folks back in Asia, that the distinction, the break between the Asians in Northeast Asia and the transplanted Asians in America couldn't have been much more than like 3,000 years. So there were archaeologists saying, but Professor Erdlichka, we're finding old things that we think are older. And remember, there's no radiocarbon dating when Erdlichka, this is the beginning of the early part of the 20th century. And Erdlichka, he kind of ruled with an iron fist. But Erdlichka wasn't a bad guy. He was a skeptic, which is what everybody in science is. We are skeptics. It's show us, prove what you got. And in fact, there were those who talked to Erdlichka and said, we think we have something older than that. We think we have sites that date back to the tail end of the Ice Age or the early post-Pleistocene. And Erdlichka said, I don't think you're right. Erdlichka said, I think that it's a fool's errand, but if you want to prove that, you have to prove a firm association between the artifacts made by these folks and geological evidence of a late Pleistocene or early post-Pleistocene context. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s when they found not Clovis points initially, but Folsom points, which are in the same general style of Clovis, except they tend to be shorter, and the flute, the channel, instead of going a third to a halfway up, the flutes go all the way up, almost all the way up to the top. The flutes are probably used for the haft. It makes it easier to haft those onto wooden shafts. Well, in the 1930s, they found these Folsom points, this variant of Clovis, actually embedded in the bones, in the rib cage of a kind of bison that the zoologists, paleontologists absolutely knew had been extinct since the end of the Pleistocene. When that was found, clear evidence, human beings were hunting these critters. These critters died off 10,000 years ago. We've got people that far back. And I'm not sure that Erdlichka was really happy with that discovery, but that kind of evidence allayed everyone's fears that they were going in the wrong direction, and it was right to be skeptical until that was found. Now, since that time, since the 30s, the Clovis and Folsom cultures have been found all over the United States. There are Clovis points found in every state of the United States, found in Canada, found in Mexico, found to some extent in South America as well. And archaeologists thought, we've got it down now. People walked over the Bering Land Bridge at the end of the Pleistocene, the last major glacial advance. Sea level was lower. A land connection between Northeast Asia and Northwest America was there. A highway across which animals walked and people followed them. And then they entered into the New World at that point. So when they did the geology, they did the glaciology, they looked at the archaeology, they said, look, people can't have been here much before 12,000 years ago. And that was kind of the line. That was Clovis was here first. There has for a long time been an undercurrent of, well, but maybe there are some sites that are older than Clovis, because stuff would come up now. Clovis was here for sure. They certainly were the first broadly successful culture. They were the first widespread inhabitants of the New World. But there's always been this sort of the consensus was there, but there were people who questioned the consensus, which is again the way science has to work. And
and there's been several sites. There were three up until recently that were attributed to an earlier peoples, a pre-Clovis people. And I just got done reading a paper that was published in 2012 about a cave site out in Oregon, where they found corpelites that they were actually able to date.
Right. I think that's Paisley. They're the Paisley Caves and On Your Knees Cave. But even back in I think it was 1980s, you've got James out of Osseo, who excavated the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, which is in western Pennsylvania. It's so west in Pennsylvania, it ought to be in Ohio. It's that close to the Ohio border. And that's a rock shelter site. Actually, that's open to the public it's a museum, and you can see it's left in the original stratigraphy is still visible. And that out of Osseo did an amazing job. I mean, just remarkable in terms of maintaining stratigraphic security, and the artifacts are firmly placed in that stratigraphic sequence. And the radiocarbon dates, which some question because, well, it's coal country, maybe coal contaminated the groundwater, but it just doesn't seem possible because this is a deep stratigraphic sequence, and all of the artifacts found above the stuff at the very bottom also are affiliated with radiocarbon dates, and the radiocarbon dates are correct. In other words, yeah, that's the right style, that's the right date for that style. And he's got stuff at the bottom that is, I think, pretty close to 14,000 years old. So that was a good day. And then you had Monteverde in Chile. Tom Dillahay excavated that site. Again, I think that's the 1990s. And again, you've got that now. Here's a site about as far removed from the Bering land bridge entry point as you can imagine, and he's got dates of 13,000. Well, if people are in South America 13,000 years ago and it's pretty firmly dated, then, oh my God, they must have, if they entered in through Beringia, it's got to be a couple of thousand years before that. Mike Waters has this amazing site, the Deborah Friedkin site in Texas, and really firm, I think they are optically stimulated luminescence dates, perfect artifacts, and his dates are 15,500. There's the Manus site, which is in Washington State. They've got a mammoth skeleton, and there is a bone spear point in one of the vertebrae of that skeleton. This animal was hunted by people, and the radiocarbon dates on the bones of that skeleton is just shy of 14,000 years ago. So,
well, see, and that could explain why we don't find as many pre-Clovis tools. Is they're using disposal or degradable materials like bone.
Yeah.
I mean, finding that preserved
it's amazing.
That's pretty good. That does not happen frequently.
And here's the deal. I think that maybe what we're talking about here is, there's a thinly dispersed human population in the New World, let's say sometime after about 20,000 years ago. And that kind of matches what we see, that the Beringia, the land bridge was open. People could walk into Alaska. They're kind of stuck there for a few thousand years until the large glaciers, the Cordilleran Glacier that's centered in the Rockies, the Laurentian Glacier that's centered in the in central Canada. Those things start melting off, and now there's this corridor, this ice-free pathway that people could enter into the rest of the New World through there.
And I know because, unfortunately, because of global warming or global climate change, which isn't real apparently, but it is affecting the archaeology in Alaska, and I know that they're finding really cool stuff up there.
Stuff is literally melting out of glaciers.
Yeah. It's the permafrost is going away, and as it's going away, I mean, sites and amazing artifacts and all kinds of cool stuff are popping up in Alaska, which is great for us. And it sucks for the rest of the world, but great for us.
But the deal here is that what's happening in archaeology is exactly what's supposed to happen in science. And I know that some of these arguments got really personal. And I think it's Adovazio who started talking about the Clovis Mafia. If it wasn't his phrase, I apologize, but I've heard that phrase bandied about, that the Clovis Mafia had this stranglehold on science and they wouldn't listen to anybody else. But at this point, scientists are supposed to be skeptical about new ideas, about new hypotheses. And
well, you're mentioning how you were being taught about other cultures that predate or date at the same time as Clovis. I was never taught that when I went to school. Yeah, they never told me that there was anything before Clovis. We were just taught that Clovis was first, and that was that. It wasn't until after I graduated and started dealing with, other people who had gone to other schools that I was like, oh, what is this other thing that was not Clovis? I don't understand. So, yeah, I mean, there are still people who will not acknowledge a pre-Clovis culture in America.
But C. Vance Haynes, who is a geologist, but who's worked a lot with archaeologists, I mean, he laid out, he said, look, and again, he wasn't quite the Erdlichka of the more recent time, because personality-wise, there's no comparison, but he laid out, he said, look, He presented himself as very skeptical about pre-Clovis stuff, but he said, here's five or six or 10 things. If you satisfy this, then me and everybody else will say, good for you. You've proven the point. And I think that Haynes was one of these guys who was brought down to Monteverde, looked around and said, you know what? He's got a site that's about 13,000 years old here. And clearly that implies a pre-Clovis presence further north. And that's the way science works. I mean, right now, I think the consensus view is that you have the consensus view is you have sites in North America that are probably at least 15,000 years old, and that implies an entry into Alaska probably a few thousand years before that.
Right. Yeah, to give them time
are there still holdouts saying, "No, it's Clovis first"? Well, sure, but that's okay. Yeah. That's the way science works. It's fine.
And there will always be people who do that. Now, the reason that this controversy is important to the theme of our podcast, the whole archaeological fantasies thing, is not because this is an actual controversy that occurs in archaeology and is a legitimate controversy. It's because since there are people that don't understand what the actual controversy is, which we have discussed, they think that we as archaeologists are refusing or are doctoring our findings to say that Clovis is the first culture in America because we're trying to hide more sophisticated or more advanced technologies of people that existed before the Clovis people in America.
And the thing that's funny about that, of course, is that the pre-Clovis sites, generally speaking, have very simple stone tool technologies. And in fact, that's one of the ironies is the reason in many cases these sites have been questioned by more traditionally oriented archaeologists is because it's sometimes not that easy to distinguish these pre-Clovis artifacts from things that nature does, because they're that simple in the sense that they don't take a whole bunch of coordinated steps to produce those artifacts. You see a Clovis point, nobody's going to look at a Clovis point and say, well, maybe nature could have made that. No,
Clovis points are very distinct.
But some of these pre-Clovis,
very beautiful.
But some of the pre-Clovis artifacts that have been presented, it's like, well, you know what? If you have pebbles smashing against each other in a stream, you'll get things like that. So, and I think,
but if, like you were saying, they're making their tools out of wood, out of bone and possibly wood, maybe shell. Right. I mean, those things are going to degrade before you can find them.
Yeah. But the deal here, the deal with how this has played out is the kind of thing that no matter what archaeologists do, the fringe people are going to attack us. So if we absolutely hold fast to the Clovis first perspective, we are being closed-minded and we should not be listened to. But if we say, you know what? These guys were right. The fringe people will say, see, the archaeologists were wrong about Clovis. They could be wrong about Atlantis too. It's that, they laughed at Columbus. So why do people laugh at me? So no matter what, if we hold the party line, we're a bunch of doubting Thomases and we have closed mind. But if we have an open mind and we change our opinions, then well, you see, archaeologists change their opinions all the time, so maybe they'll change their opinion about Atlantis or ancient astronauts. Archaeologists, like scientists, change their opinion when the data are forthcoming that show we were wrong, and we embrace that. That's great.
And there's not been any evidence to date showing that there were Atlanteans or lizard people or aliens anywhere near America at any point, let alone before 15,000 years ago.
Show us the money, right? Show us the definitive proof, and we do. It is a canard. It is a libel against us to say we have closed minds. No, we have open minds, but we realize the old saying that it's good to have an open mind, but you have to remember when you have an open mind, people are going to throw a lot of garbage into it, and we need a filter. We need a way of filtering out the garbage. And when we're wrong, we don't just admit it grudgingly, we embrace it and say, fantastic, a new way of looking at the past. We love that. But the bar is pretty high. And you can't complain about the bar. You can't complain about there being the bar in the first place. Because if you complain about it, then you're not doing archaeology, you're not doing science, you're doing something else.
Yeah. So that's why I wanted to bring up the Clovis first debate. I wanted people who are interested in the actual debate to hear both sides of it and to know where the debate is. And it's not really a debate anymore. I mean, most people who I talk to about this are pretty accepting of there being a pre-Clovis
the
people.
consensus has shifted, and it shifted not because of style or personality. It shifted because the data, because of evidence. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what's, like you said, that's what's supposed to happen. We have evidence that there are pre-Clovis sites. There's no reason to deny that there were people here before the Clovis were. Here.
I mean, and a general thing here, when I was in graduate school and I took a course in human evolution, I was taught that the oldest evidence for anatomically modern Homo sapiens 40,000 years ago, somewhere in Europe. When I teach that course today, I talk about 200,000-year-old skeletons in southern Africa. Yeah. And that's all because over the course of the 35 years that I've been teaching, the evidence has shown that.
Well, when I was going through school, we were taught that Neanderthal did not have language because there had never been a hyoid bone that had been recovered. And I want to say the year I graduated, or maybe it was the year after I graduated, they found a Neanderthal hyoid bone.
There you go.
So it's that completely changed everything. And now we're attributing religion and burials and all kinds of things to the Neanderthal now because we accept that they have language. If they had language, they could very well have had culture, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, things change and things change quickly. I mean, it just depends on the evidence that you find and how strong that evidence is. And I mean,
that's the fun. That's the fun.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, like I said, I mean, you teach something completely different than what you were taught. And that's what it's going to be for me, in 10 years from now. I mean, I'm going to be telling people things that I was not taught, or I will be correcting people about things that I was taught that we now know are not true.
I caught myself, Sarah. I was almost going to say, in archaeology, nothing's written in stone, but it sort of is. So never mind.
Except for some of those things that are actually written on stone.
There you go.
Yeah. Teotihuacan or whatever.
All right.
Okay, well.
Great fun, Sarah.
Yes, it was, and thank you very much. And keep us updated on your site as you get more information on it.
Absolutely.
But we don't do dinosaurs. No, 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 we don't do.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archaefantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archaefantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archaefantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. Rage your trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.